Okay, so thank you so much for having us attend your roundtable. So, Iridur Marang, good day. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands that we're gathering upon today. And for me, it's the mighty Gadigal people. I'd also like to pay my respects to my elders, both past and present, and extend these respects to the mob here today. My name is Nattlie Smith. I'm the branch manager for the Strategic Insights branch for the National Indigenous Australians Agency, or NIAAO for short. And I'm also a proud Wiradjuri woman from the Centre of New South Wales, Condobolin, or Condo for short. So thank you to Levi and the IDN Roundtable attendees for inviting us today to chat about the work of NIAAO and the framework for the governance of Indigenous data. So just to begin with, I'll be talking more to the history and policy context of the framework and not the content of the guidelines and actions. Hopefully this will give everyone a sense of where the framework has come from, how it was co-designed, and the next steps towards publication and implementation. Next slide, Dinesh. So what will the framework do? The framework will support the commitment to Indigenous self-determination by improving the accessibility, relevance, interpretability, and timeliness of government-held data. It aims to increase awareness, acceptance, and support for the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty among federal government agencies. Next slide. Dinesh. An important question to address is why it's called the Framework for Governance of Indigenous Data and not Indigenous Data Sovereignty. While co-designing the framework, many of our Indigenous partners emphasise that government should not redefine IDS for Indigenous people. This is because IDS is Indigenous-led, and so the role of government is not to claim IDS as its own initiative. Instead, a better way to think about the framework is a stepping stone towards greater awareness, acceptance, and support for IDS by government agencies. To this effect, the framework guides agencies towards respectfully supporting the Indigenous right to self-determination, especially as it relates to data. And as you can see on the screen here, these are the framework guidelines and actions. Very briefly, I'll outline the basics of what the framework and what federal agencies will have to do. It contains 4 guidelines for all Commonwealth agencies to follow. Guidelines 1, partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Guideline 2, better data-related capabilities, including partnership skills. Guideline 3, provide knowledge of data assets. Guideline 4, build an inclusive data system. And as you can see on the slide, to give you a sense of what implementing these guidelines will involve in practice, we've listed some of the examples under each. And these examples are categorized as prepare, grow, extend, according to how much data maturity is required to implement them across the Commonwealth. And the framework guidelines will be applicable to all phases of the data life cycle, as it is spelled out by the, I can never get this right, Maim Nair Wingara. So as you can see on the screen, what this potentially could look like. Thanks, Dinesh. But given what is being discussed at this roundtable, you probably all know what this framework is to some extent. So instead of focusing on the framework's content, we'll speak more about the history and policy context for the document. This includes a short account of where the framework came from and the next steps from here. The journey so far. The push to have Indigenous data sovereignty recognised and supported by government goes back at least a decade and probably much further than that. But in 2021, there were a number of factors leading to the development of this framework. A bit of context on government processes around data will help us understand the history a bit better. In the Commonwealth Government, made up of many departments and agencies, all whole of government data policies are cleared through a group of specific committees. Of relevance for us, there is the High Level Deputy Secretary's Data Group, or DSDG. And at the lower level, there is the Data Champions Network, or DCN. The DSDG tends to decide on the strategic priorities, while the DCN does projects and the DSDG thinks needs to be done. The DSDG and the DCN are made up of representatives from a variety of key federal government agencies. Throughout 2021, there was a DCN working group that co-authored a guidance paper called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data. The guidance paper recommended to the DSDG and the Commonwealth needed to respond to Indigenous data sovereignty, among other things. Importantly, it recommended a framework to be co-designed with Indigenous partners. The co-design idea came about because NIAAO was being questioned by prominent people about what our definition of co-design was and why it wasn't being done more often. The DSDG agreed to the recommendations without any question. Then in March 2022, we kicked off as a co-design process that I'll explain in the following slides. The framework was completed in June 23. It then went through a government clearing process, and on the 6th of December, it received endorsement in principle by the Secretary's Board. Now we're going back to the Secretary's Board with more details around the timeframes for implementation, with the intention of getting agreement to endorse and publish the framework. And I just wanted to just say in confidence that this morning, as we're heading towards going back through the Secretary's Board, we had the DSDG come together at a session, and everyone agreed, which was very heartwarming, to publish, and some of the agencies are already starting to develop implementation plans, and it was really great to see that everyone was fully endorsing and wanting to go in the right direction with the Secretary's Board. So why was a framework needed? In 2021, guidance papers pictured on the slide, a few things were noted leading to a recommendation to co-design a framework. Notably, the guidance paper recognised the importance of data for Indigenous self-determination, the fact that Indigenous people require access to government-held data and a greater say over what is collected and how it's governed, the wide variability in government's engagement with Indigenous people on data, and most obviously the need to respectively respond to the Indigenous data sovereignty movement in Australia. A critical inspiration for the recommendation was the 2016 book, Indigenous Data Sovereignty Towards an Agenda. NIAAO staff involved in this work studied it back to front, and it was valuable fuel for the fire. How was the framework made? As I noted earlier, it was agreed by the DSDG in 2021 that the framework was to be co-designed with Indigenous people. The details of the co-design are slightly complicated, but at the end of the day, the framework was co-designed by two bodies: a subcommittee of the DSDG, which included critical Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners, including a number of experts on IDS, and a DCN working group, also including Indigenous and non-government partners. The DSDG subcommittee met in March 2022, co-designed the terms of reference, and our Indigenous subcommittee partners nominated people to be invited to join the working group. The working group first met in May 2022. In simple terms, the DSDG subcommittee did the priority setting and diplomatic work, and the DCN working group did the heavy lifting required to draft the framework. So for policy context, now I'll move to describing the policy context in which the framework will be implemented by all federal government agencies. The National Agreement. As everyone here will know, the biggest policy context for the framework is the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. The National Agreement and its priority reforms are literally reflected in each of the 4 framework guidelines. And the parties to the agreement included the coalition of peaks in all levels of government: Commonwealth, state, territory, and local government. And as people are aware, there are 17 socio-economic outcomes, identified a range of life areas, including health, education, employment, housing, safety, and strengthening culture and language. These are the what of the closing the gap, and there are 4 priority reforms. These are the how of closing the gap. Priority reforms 3 and 4 are at the centre of what I'll be talking about. today because it spells out the parties' commitments around government transformation and data sharing. And as you can see on the slide, we've got the key components of Priority Reform 3. So I'll just allow people to have a read through that. And then we'll share this slide deck, Levi, and key components of Priority Reform 4. And as you can see, the key Priority Reform 4 are providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and community access to disaggregated regional data and information, establishing partnerships to improve collection, access, management and use of data, and making data more transparent, and building capacity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities. So as you can see, current status of Priority Reform 4, the agreement includes the establishment of 6 community data projects across Australia. And of these, the Blacktown project is the furthest along. Projects are in their early establishment phase, and each project will be shaped by the self-identified priorities of communities. Department of Social Services has been a critical friend in supporting the Blacktown project, and DSS has already undertaken an extensive data inventory exercise and had a good understanding of their Indigenous data sets. The NIAAO has funded the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare to develop community data portals on the Regional Insights for Indigenous Communities website platform, RIFIC, collect localised data sets from each community, provided verification and cleansing services, and uploaded them onto the community data portal, provide training and support in how to use the portal, work with identified participants to determine dashboards, visuals and analysis and reporting requirements, and work with communities to develop access and use protocols for secure access to community data portals and data sharing agreements. And just a highlight with a case study of the Connected Beginnings community level dashboards. It's a Commonwealth Government initiative. It aims to improve access to existing early childhood, maternal and child health and family support services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. It supports self-determination and First Nations data sovereignty through community level data dashboards, allows communities to access accurate, current and meaningful data. The dashboards are a joint initiative between Department of Education and Department of Health and Aged Care, and include health and education data. Data pipelines and data custodians were established to improve data access and for communities. And the Commonwealth currently funds 41 Connected Beginning projects across Australia, supporting over 18,000 First Nations children aged 0 to 5 to achieve the learning and development milestones and to enable a positive transition to school. So thanks, Dinesh. And as mentioned previous to this, the Productivities Commission review. These are some of the key findings of the review. And I would be interested to hear after the presentation whether the call for an Indigenous Data Commissioner, which came from our Indigenous partners during the development of the framework, and what the PC has asked for, a Bureau of Indigenous Data. So it'd be interesting to get people's thoughts on that. And just to note that the coalition of peaks and the government have 6 months to respond to the PC's recommendations. And that's it. Thanks everyone for listening. And we hope that that gives you a better sense on how government is working to empower Indigenous people with their data. Are there any questions?